Claire. I'm really glad we're doing this again. I feel like now that the webinar is being offered on a monthly basis, these sort of in-between sessions give us a chance not only to update the things we talked about during the webinar, but also to work in even more of the audience questions. And my understanding is you've been able to select a few questions from our audience members that we weren't able to get to last week.
Yes, I know we talked in depth about everything that's happening in Ukraine and with Russia's invasion, but as you can imagine, there were plenty of leftover questions. So if there's any month to be doing continuing the conversation, I think it would be this month. So with that, one of our audience members asked you, Dan, what's the potential for Russian insiders or oligarchs to mount a coup and remove Putin?
Well, it's certainly possible. One of the more unanticipated aspects of the way the war has progressed has been the effectiveness of the Western sanctions on Russia. And while most of the Russian people really aren't in a position to do much about the economic hardships that they're now feeling, the relatively small group of billionaires who Putin has empowered and enriched, and who they in turn have protected, are getting increasingly squeezed. Not only are many of them seeing their very, very sizable holdings diminished in value very, very quickly, but also some of their luxuries, the planes, the yachts, and so on, are all of a sudden becoming much more difficult for them. So we've even seen a few of the oligarchs, all but one outside of Russia, just to note, who have spoken out critically against the war. But I think the possibility of a coup, frankly, is a little bit far-fetched. And there have been talks about a revolution from the people, about a military coup removing Putin because the war is going badly, or the oligarchs who might be in the best position to remove him. I think that's a bit fanciful and a bit hopeful on many of our parts. That even while the Ukrainian military is persisting to a much greater degree than had originally been anticipated by any observer, either in Russia or in the West, this still appears to be just a very long, very difficult, very bloody, and very deadly slog. And so it's very tempting to think, well, maybe there's just a magic answer, that someone or someones will sneak in and remove Putin from power. I think that's unlikely. It's entirely possible, the longer this continues, that the oligarchs, some of them, may pressure Putin to rethink his goals. And we've actually seen some evidence that Putin's demands this week are a little bit less ambitious than they were at the outset of the war. He's no longer talking about the Ukrainian leaders as drug addicts and as Nazis. He's no longer demanding their removal. So while his current set of demands is still at face value unacceptable to the US and to NATO and to Ukraine, he has scaled back to some degree. That may be as a result of pressure from his allies, but that's a much more likely way for them to have their influence felt than simply removing him from office.
Thank you, Dan. Our next question is, how is the American public assessing Biden in his handling of this crisis?
Well, it's been very notable that we've seen a significant rise in Biden's poll numbers over the last couple of weeks. And while it's not by overwhelming numbers, the American people are giving Biden very favorable ratings, and specifically how he is handling the crisis in Ukraine. There's two things going on here underneath those poll numbers, though, that are worth examining. One, of course, as you know and our audience knows, is that by imposing sanctions, not just on Russia more generally, but specifically on Russia energy sources, on oil and gas, the West is going to be facing, and is already facing, much, much higher gasoline prices. Right now, we're seeing upwards of more than 70% of Americans saying that they're willing to pay higher gasoline prices if that can have a role in thwarting Putin toward the achievement of his goals. But it's an open question how long those poll numbers will hold up. And as the weeks turn into months and Americans begin paying $7, $8 or more for gasoline, that to me is a key question. What Putin's counting on at the core here is a gamble that Westerners in the US and in Western Europe don't have the stomach for long-term discomfort. And he feels like he can outweigh us. So it's going to be a real test of Biden's leadership to see whether he can maintain public support for these sanctions, even in the face of some economic difficulty. But more broadly, there's a real opportunity here for the president. It's worth remembering that the precipitating event of Biden's slide in the polls last summer was not COVID, but it was Afghanistan. And even though while the US pullout from Afghanistan was not an issue that most Americans ranked as being of great concern to them, it really did damage their impression of Biden as a competent and a strong leader. Now it's entirely possible that the crisis in Ukraine might give Biden a chance to regain that stature. There's no guarantee that he will in the long run, but at least in the first couple weeks of the war, he has risen in the stature of the American voters. And while clearly the president and his advisors would prefer that there was not a war, at least in the very short term, it does seem to have accrued to his political benefit.
So our final question that we will address in this segment is another big one, but this person asks, will China take this opportunity to invade Taiwan?
Boy, I don't have the mug that you and Jessica got me a couple of years ago, Claire, the one that said no to predictions, yes to coffee. But I wish I did have it at hand. I think it's in the cupboard. And I apologize. So I don't know whether China is going to invade Taiwan, but there are a couple points worth considering. Number one, it is clear that China, at least at the outset of the war, was really relishing the distraction the problems in Ukraine would create for the US. And for some time now, Biden has been talking about a so-called pivot to Asia, the idea that the US would begin to pay more and more attention to the Pacific Rim, and particularly the Chinese aggression in that area. And the Chinese leadership, understandably, had determined that the more time and attention that the US and West need to devote to Eastern Europe and to Ukraine, the less time and attention they'd have for matters on the Pacific Rim, most notably Taiwan. So it is clear that even before the war, that China and Russia were strengthening their relationship. Putin and Xi signed a very, very expansive and comprehensive document which strengthened and deepened relationships between the two countries. And it's worth noting that Putin waited until the end of the Winter Olympics in Beijing before mounting the offensive into Ukraine. So the Chinese definitely see an advantage for them in this, or at least they did at the beginning. But just as Putin is surprised by the unanticipated difficulty that the war has caused him and his military, and just as the West is surprised, China is very surprised as well. They didn't anticipate this kind of slowdown. And now, while on one hand, they like the idea of the US being distracted from their own potential aggression against Taiwan, they're now seeing much bigger problems. The Chinese economy is struggling as a result of COVID and demographic changes, and disruptions to the international economic order does not help China at all. And even of greater concern, an alliance with Russia, when most of the world stands with Ukraine, poses real reputational threats to China. And while that isn't necessarily a priority of the Chinese government, they've worked very hard to further their international relationships around the world in recent years. And so this is a setback. Short answer to the original question. Number one, we don't know if China is going to invade Taiwan. Number two, they certainly saw this war as an opportunity to distract the US, which might increase the likelihood of such a move. But third, it's gotten a lot more complicated for China. And the economic and reputational challenges that they're facing have made them a little bit more subdued in their support of Russia. long, long way of saying we don't know, and I don't make predictions.
People are obviously making this parallel that, Russia has said that Ukraine should be a part of Russia, and China's made the same argument about Taiwan. I would ask you, are those actually equivalent, or are they different?
In the eyes of the West, they are parallel situations, because in the eyes of the West and Western Europe and NATO, both Ukraine and Taiwan are sovereign nations. And so at the broadest level, there really is no distinction. It's somewhat more complicated for China because they obviously see Taiwan as part of their own country. And even while the Russians have made it clear historically that Ukraine is a part of Russia, for many years now it has been an independent country. So for China to square that circle, it's going to require a certain amount of linguistic and diplomatic gymnastics. But for the West, the status of the two countries is similar. The difference for NATO and for the United States is that Taiwan is of much greater strategic importance than Ukraine. And one of the things you've noticed over the last week is President Biden and Secretary of State Tony Blinken and Vice President Harris on her trip to Europe have all used exactly the same phrase. They keep saying, not 1 inch of NATO territory. And they're drawing the line very, very forcefully between Ukraine and the NATO countries. So Taiwan, like countries that belong to NATO, are of much greater strategic importance to the US and the West. And so the message that the United States is trying to send, not just to Russia, but to China also, is that the two situations are parallel, but the import of Taiwan is even greater. And in addition to the other reasons I was talking about a minute or two ago, their goal there is to give China pause. Not only is the war not going well for your friend Putin, not only is this creating some economic challenges for you that you'd rather not have, but know that as committed as we are to Ukraine, the US says, we're even more committed to Taiwan. So think seriously, even while we're distracted by Eastern Europe, about more aggressive moves in that direction. Last quick point on this, Claire. It's not as if China is the only foreign player enjoying the US focus on Eastern Europe. North Korea has begun intercontinental ballistic missile testing. And it's certainly not a coincidence that they're doing that at the same time. The US attention is focused on Eastern Europe. And we're seeing the same thing in other parts of the world as well.
Great. Well, thank you for that, Dan. And thank you so much again for taking more time out of your day to help answer some of these pressing questions that are important to our audience and to the broader American public.
Well, as you know, Claire, because we've talked about it quite a bit, my favorite part of the webinars is addressing the audience's questions and observations. So the fact that we get to do a little bit extra like we did today is something I really enjoy too. Our audience members, I know you agree, are just really, really smart, interesting people. And so anything we can do to keep this conversation going in between the webinars themselves is something I'm all for.
Great. Well, have a great rest of your week, Dan. And for you and for the rest of our audience, we will see you in April for the Dan Schnur Political Report.
Already looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Claire. Thanks so much to all of you as well.
Thanks, Dan. Bye.